Shalom, Hanukkah Sameach. Transylvania is in Romania, I believe. Make a note of it. I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Nnoah Yogev, whose idea this was, for all their hard work, dedication, and expertise. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Is this the clicker?
Yes.
Okay. At the INSS. You've heard an excellent historical overview and a very useful practical guide to what's going on with BDS. My focus is theoretical. My talk today has three main points to make about the thought of anti-Israel academic boycotts, or BDS in theory, in view of the stated positions of its own intellectuals. I focus first on what I call the philosophy of diasporism, in contrast to Zionism. Second, the rhetoric of intellectual terrorism, as opposed to the free exchange of ideas. And third, the logic of fetishism, or the psychological basis in fantasy of the ubiquitous, overzealous singling out of Israel for excessive criticism and unwarranted opprobrium by the forces of the academic left in Europe and the United States in particular. With regards to my third point about anti-Zionist desires, fantasies, drives, the Slovenian cultural critic Slavoj Žižek defines the grammar of fetishism's lurid obsession according to the simple formula, I know very well, but nevertheless. This means that there is something I must know isn't the case, or can't possibly be true in fact, yet somehow I manage to seem to forget, repress, or set aside what I know, so as to persist in service to my perverse passion anyway, in spite of what reason and evidence say, because I enjoy the fantasy too much to let it go. Don't kid yourself. BDS gets off on demonizing Israel. As I will show in the last part of my talk, stay tuned, the precise specification of the boycott movement's Israel fetish goes something like this. In the rational part of one's brain, one surely knows that Israel can't actually be central to everything that's wrong with the world, but one likes feeling that it is, and will therefore act, speak, and write as if Israel is magic. The movement to boycott Israeli academics is not an entirely reasonable affair, in other words, but something half-mad, sick, and twisted. Let's face it, BDS is anti-Semitic to the core, insofar as adherents at some level drink the Kool-Aid of what looks a lot like the classic conspiracy theory, according to which Jews control the fate of the world, even if one knows better, as my examples show. So point one, diasporism, or the ends of BDS. The idea of diasporism, as I call it, is that Zionism is the problem and not the solution. No longer the answer to the old Jewish question as once posed in Europe, but the form which the new Jewish question in the Middle East now takes. By mimesis and inversion, the solution to today's Jewish problem is thus mockingly, half-mockingly presented, I should say, in the irritating notion of some sort of ostensible right of return to diaspora for Israeli Jews, especially those of European background. For example, Judith Butler, in her 2012 book of anti-Zionist wit and wisdom, Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, reminds her readers that dispersion is the mode in which Jews have in fact survived. It's an astonishing claim given that she left out the word barely, or perhaps miraculously, in view of the history of the 20th century, nor does she credit the Zionist entity with having contributed, in fact, anything to Jewish flourishing. Instead, by contrast with the delights of statelessness, she notes that nothing risks courting aggression more than Israel's, in her words, colonial subjugation of the Palestinians, which can only be ended once and for all, as she argues at length in her book, by terminating Israel's very existence as a Jewish state. For diasporism's own Herzl, in short, the biggest threat to the well-being of the Jews is self-determination as a people in a state capable of defending itself. Nothing risks courting aggression more. Instead, Jewish sovereignty should be dispersed or done away with. What can one say to this? Where to begin? Fortunately, the great Philip Roth already answered that question for us 20 years ago, we should start by laughing. The celebrated Jewish American writer anticipated by more than a decade Butler's surrealist turn in political philosophy with his 1993 novel, Operation Shylock, and he made fun of it. Composed in the wake of the First Intifada, Roth's fiction presents its reader with the uncanny figure of a doppelganger impersonating the author himself, traveling around Israel announcing public lectures under the catchy title, Diasporism, the Only Solution to the Jewish Problem. Roth's fictional double earnestly but dementedly pontificates in a prescient parody of everything wrong with the thought of today's BDS movement, avant la lettre, as follows. Diasporism seeks to promote the dispersion of the Jews in the West. It seeks to avert the catastrophe of a second Holocaust brought about by the exhaustion of Zionism as a political and ideological force. Zionism has become counterproductive and itself the foremost Jewish problem. Once the European Jews have been resettled and the population of Israel has been halved, those Jews who have lived in an Islamic cultural matrix for centuries can continue to do so in peace and harmony with their Arab neighbors. You know what will happen in Warsaw at the railway station when the first trainload of Jews returns? There will be crowds to welcome them. People will be jubilant. People will be in tears. They will be shouting, "Our Jews are back. Our Jews are back." Whatever hatred for Jews may be present in Europe, there are, ranged against this residual anti-Semitism, powerful currents of enlightenment and morality sustained by the memory of the Holocaust. No such bulwark against anti-Semitism exists in Islam. Exterminating a Jewish nation would cause Islam to lose not a single night's sleep, except for the great night of celebration. Israel is no longer in the Jewish interest. Now, if Roth's satire sounds too far-fetched to be credited as anything other than sheer farce, then please have a listen to Professor Mark Ellis, a contributor to the pro-BDS anti-Zionist anthology, Deconstructing Zionism, a critique of political metaphysics. The process of ending a Jewish state of Israel would probably precipitate a mass exodus of Jewish Israelis to Europe and the United States, if, that is, the borders of the various states would accept millions of Jewish Israelis. Albeit, Ellis is slightly less optimistic and more indifferent to the fate of the Jews than Roth's more solicitous apparition. Nevertheless, the absurd premise of de-Judaizing the Jewish state for the good of all concerned is the same lunatic idea Roth's narrative travesties. And all the other salient features of the passage I just read are manifestly present in the thought of BDS, too. Thus, Michael Martyr and Gianni Vattimo confidently assert the biggest threat to the well-being and security of Israeli Jews, and often by implication of Jews who live elsewhere in the world and are assumed to be the supporters of Israeli policies, is neither Iran nor Syria, it is the state of Israel itself. By contrast, diaspora seductively beckons all those imbued with an appropriately postmodern sensibility, since even when not openly anti-Zionist, deconstruction is the possibility of justice, and so it is the necessity of diaspora. It is imperative to deconstruct Zionism, not out of hatred, but out of intense concern for the Jewish Israelis who are set on a path of self-destruction. Touching sentiments, to be sure, yet in a radio interview last summer, one of Italy's best-known living deconstructionist philosophers, the very same Professor Vattimo, expressed his intense concern in that context as follows: "I'd like to shoot those Zionist bastards." He went on to recommend that Hamas be supplied with better rockets, surely once again out of compassion for the Jewish Israelis' weird self-destructiveness. Moreover, in his chapter titled How to Become an Anti-Zionist, Vattimo urges that Ahmadinejad of Iran was right to demand the end of the state of Israel. Can you feel the love, the intense concern? In short, ending Israel is a moral imperative for the diasporist point of view that rejects or deconstructs, or with Philip Roth, parodies Zionism for the benefit of both Arab and Jew alike. Even though, interestingly, it is the Jews alone who are to be treated once more to the improving effects of diaspora, while ironically the Palestinians are condemned to suffer a fall into what the BDS philosophers themselves must recognize better than anyone as the metaphysically dubious fictitiousness of all origins, which brings me to my last two quick points about intellectual terrorism and fetishism. The French philosopher, sociologist, and literary theorist Jean-François Lyotard defines the essence of terror in an information age as the threat of exclusion from conversation, dialogue, exchange of symbols. By terror, Lyotard writes in a classic text, I mean the efficiency gained by eliminating or threatening to eliminate a player from the language game one shares with him. BDS fits this model of argumentation by intimidation perfectly. As the leading BDS scholar activist Stephen Salaita declares openly in his book of 2011, Israel's Dead Soul, multiculturalism is a place from which Zionists deserve expulsion. In the same chapter, he repeats for emphasis, we need to kick Israel out of multiculturalism, insisting on his dream of ethnic studies cleansing. Moreover, BDS pursues its threats of exclusion, expulsion, and elimination by resort to intellectual terrorism, as defined by the cultural critic Ibn Warraq. Terrorism, in an academic context, Warraq observes, means seeking to convince not by arguments or historical analysis, but by spraying charges of racism, imperialism, and Eurocentrism from a moral high ground. Anyone who disagrees with the practitioners of politically correct terrorism in theory has insult heaped upon him. Sometimes the insults are couched in academic-sounding language, as with the founding father of post-colonial studies, Edward Said, whose spirit hovers over BDS. And sometimes they're even less subtle. The liberal political theorist Alan Johnson, in his chapter of The Case Against Academic Boycotts of Israel, reports having one of his own lectures interrupted by refrains of the clever taunt, "Fuck off our fucking campus, you fucking Zionist." It's an interesting argument. The point is that both BDS professors and student activists are comfortable rejecting norms of civility while defending this unethical practice with radical philosophies that denigrate quotidian politeness and ordinary decency as mere bourgeois prejudices when it comes to dealing with Zionists. And now, at last, a brief concluding word about the Israel fetish, or what I call the anti-Semitic unconscious. In the atmosphere on campus of selective inclusiveness and intolerant tolerance as enforced by the codes of political correctness, Israel is in danger of becoming the key symbol or master signifier of un-PC insensitivity to not just some, but, believe it or not, all of the world's victims. Once again, Salaita put it well, this time on social media, when he tweeted the following, "Hate is such a strong word. That's why it's my preferred verb when discussing racism, colonization, neoliberalism, sexism, and Israel." Note that alongside the boycott movement's favorite word, hate, only one of these terms is in fact a proper noun or name referring to a particular concrete geographic and political entity. The rest are labels for either patterns of behavior stigmatized as immoral or states of mind understood to be beyond the pale. That's what I mean by calling Israel the fetishized sign of insensitivity or master signifier of malevolence, capable of representing all sorts of wrongdoing in the eyes of her detractors. Israel thus serves a useful psychological function. Hating Israel, it turns out, is a lot like what fearing witches or other dark supernatural beings always was. A welcome relief from having to face the fact that in life there exists a certain amount of suffering which we don't immediately know what to do about. As another prominent BDS professor put it in a blog post defending Salaita's infamous tweets, Israel has come to be associated in the eyes of many with colonization, racism, occupation, and ethnic cleansing. Indeed, the blogger, a prominent American professor of political science, should know, since it is exactly these kinds of spurious associations that BDS thinkers like him tirelessly labor to produce and promote. And it's more than just blogs and tweets of some extremists. Even in the case of the notorious Professor Salaita, in his book, which I cited earlier, a work of pseudo-scholarship, in many ways worse than the vile racist tweets that seem to have cost him a job, he writes, "I conceptualize Zionism as deeply inhumane, ethically and as destructive politically for Jews and Arabs alike, and for humanity in general. Moreover, this supercharged scapegoating mentality in which one small country bears the weight of all humanity's suffering on its shoulders circulates between faculty and students. As the San Francisco Bay Area activist Laura Kiswani put it recently at a public rally, bringing down Israel will really benefit everyone in the world and everyone in society, particularly workers. You can see why this is so, since Israel is responsible for racism, sexism, colonialism, and neoliberalism. In short, Israel, it seems, is magic indeed, the very epicenter of all injustice. Many other examples of this kind of fetishism. I know Israel can't really be a unique source of harm to the whole planet, but nevertheless, I feel that it is, and will say so at the top of my lungs, could be cited from other texts by authors tied to BDS if there were time. I do that and other things in my forthcoming book, from which today's talk is derived, Israel in Theory, the Jewish State and the Cultural Left. Thank you.